They say the mountains keep their secrets, but what they don't tell you is that some of those secrets are alive, and if you listen close enough, you can hear them breathing. In the autumn of 1874, 3 men were found half buried in the mud of Elkhorn Creek, each with a hole in his skull and eyes still open, as if staring at something behind you that you can't turn to see. The locals whispered the name of the boy they all suspected, a boy too small to lift the rifle that fired those rounds, yet seen walking out of the woods with it resting on his shoulder like a king carrying his crown. His name was Thomas Weaver. He was 12 years old, and if you believe the rumors, he didn't just kill those men, he judged them. The official files are locked away in the basement of the Mercer County Courthouse, stamped with the kind of language men in power use when they want something to disappear. Matter resolved by mutual agreement. But in the coal-scarred valleys of West Virginia, nothing disappears. The land remembers, the wind remembers, and the Weaver boy, he became a shadow in their memory, a reminder that some children are born wrong, or perhaps born right, in a world that is wrong. You need to understand the soil he grew from. These were not gentle hills. The Appalachian spine had been cracked open for its coal, its veins gutted by machines that shook the ground day and night. The Consolidated Coal Company owned the mountains, the rivers, the air. They owned men's time, their families, their future, and they enforced that ownership with a private army of ex-soldiers and killers. The locals called them coal police, but they were not lawmen. They were the law. This was the atmosphere Thomas Weaver was born into. A place where the difference between life and death was measured not in laws, but in who you feared most. His father, Samuel, was a miner who had fought for the Union in the war. His hands were as hard as the stone he worked, his lungs blackened with dust. His older brother, Jacob, had the defiant temper of youth, the kind that burns bright and dies early. But Thomas was something else. He was small, quiet, and unsettling. His dark eyes seemed to read people, stripping away every polite layer until he found what you didn't want anyone to see. Even as a child, he could look at you and tell if you were about to lie. He never played with the other boys. Instead, he followed his grandfather Ezekiel into the woods, learning to hunt, track, and kill with a precision that made grown men nervous. Ezekiel didn't teach him the way a man teaches a child. He taught him like he was training a weapon. By the time he was 10, Thomas could move through the forest without a sound. He could place a bullet where he wanted it at 50 yards, in the dark, in the rain. He carried a Spencer repeating rifle, a weapon his grandfather had kept since the war. 7 rounds, lever action, deadly in the hands of a skilled man, or in this case, a skilled boy. And here's what no one in town wanted to say aloud. Thomas didn't just know how to kill, he understood when. That instinct, the cold timing, was what made him dangerous. So when 3 coal company enforcers rode up to the Weaver cabin one September evening, nobody in those hills was surprised that things ended in blood. But the strange part, the part that still makes old miners lower their voices when they speak of it, is what Thomas did after. He walked out of the trees, rifle still warm, and told the first man who asked what happened. They deserved worse, and every man who heard it believed him. Because deep down they all knew some crimes don't need a jury, they need an executioner, and sometimes God sends you one in the body of a boy. If you want to understand what Thomas Weaver became, you have to understand the machine he was born under, because no man, no boy, survives the Appalachian coal empire without being changed by it. In the early 1870s, West Virginia was more than a state, it was an extraction site. The Consolidated Coal Company wasn't just digging in the earth, they were digging into the soul of every man who worked for them. They controlled wages, housing, stores, doctors, even the churches. If you breathed on their terms. Coal company law was simple, obedience or ruin. There were no legal appeals, no second chances. If you crossed them, they blacklisted you. That meant no work, no credit, no roof. You were exiled in your own homeland, turned into a walking warning for others to obey. But blacklisting was the merciful punishment. The other kind came on horseback in the middle of the night, wearing the faces of the coal police, ex-Confederates, discharged Union veterans, and drifters who had learned that the company's coin bought more than liquor. It bought permission. Permission to break bones, permission to take what they wanted, permission to kill. They lived in a boarding house called Devil's Rest, just outside Beckley, a long, low building that smelled of sweat, whiskey, and rot, its walls thin enough that passing travelers could hear the laughter of men planning who they'd visit next. In the barroom, a map of the county hung on the wall, dotted with pins marking problem households. You didn't want your name in that room. For years, the Weaver family had managed to keep themselves off that map. Their cabin sat just outside company-owned land, and Samuel Weaver, though quietly resentful, kept his head down. He worked his shifts, took the script they paid him in, shopped at their overpriced store, but every year the company reached a little further into the mountains. And in 1874 they reached the Weaver cabin. That summer, conditions in the mines had collapsed into something close to murder. Cave-ins were weekly. Gas pockets killed men in minutes. The company refused to buy new timber supports, claiming budgetary constraints, while executives ordered new brass fittings for their mansions. Samuel had watched too many men die for no reason except profit. So he made a choice. He wrote a petition. 47 miners signed it, naming the supervisors responsible for ignoring safety violations. It was a direct challenge to the company's authority, and a death sentence for anyone foolish enough to think it would change anything. One of those 47 men, Henry Caldwell, carried more than a pickaxe into the mine. He carried debt, and debt in a company town was just another form of shackles. When the company offered him a way out, in exchange for the names of every man behind the petition, he took it. By the time Samuel handed the petition to Foreman Augustus Blackwood, the decision had already been made. Blackwood tore the paper to pieces in front of the other miners, his pale eyes never leaving Samuel's face. "Every man who signed this," he said, "will meet with me before the day is out." In the mountains, a statement like that wasn't a request. It was a ritual. Men who met with Blackwood were found days later, accidentally crushed under collapsed timbers or drowned in mine sumps. That night, Samuel told his sons the truth. Their lives were about to change. Jacob, the older, wanted to fight. Thomas said nothing. He just listened. Then came the sound. Horses, 3 of them, steady, deliberate, predators arriving for the kill. The men who dismounted were the company's trinity of violence. Marcus Finch, tall and cold-eyed, Dale Hutchinson, a brute who enjoyed the work too much, and James Crawford, the quiet one. The kind you never hear until the knife is already in your back. What passed between those 3 men and the Weavers that night is not written in any court record. But the next time anyone saw Finch, Hutchinson, or Crawford, they were lying in shallow graves at Elkhorn Creek, their mouths full of mud, and the boy, the quiet one, was walking out of the woods with his rifle. "They deserved worse," he said, and the way he said it, you knew he meant it. By the spring of 1816, the school had gained a reputation in the nearby towns, not for academic excellence, but for the uncanny discipline of its students. The children who returned home for brief visits spoke in measured tones, avoided eye contact, and reacted to sudden noises with a shiver that seemed far too old for their age. Mothers whispered about bruises hidden beneath sleeves. Fathers, especially those who had signed their children over to the care of the Murphy family, found excuses not to ask questions they weren't prepared to hear answers to. But in April, an incident occurred that could not be swept aside. The event began in the dead of night, when the lanterns in the east wing should have been extinguished. Yet one flickered to life. A small figure, 8-year-old Samuel Kearney, had been caught attempting to escape. He was barefoot, shivering, and clutching a torn scrap of paper in his hand. No one outside the Murphy household ever learned what was written on it, but rumor had it the note contained only one chilling sentence: "They are not teaching us to read." The boy was dragged back into the main hall, where the other children were roused from their beds and forced to gather. A lesson was to be made. The matriarch, Agnes Murphy, stood at the head of the room in her black gown, her iron-gray hair bound so tightly it seemed to pull the lines of her face into permanent severity. In her hand she held the long wooden pointer normally used to guide young eyes along the alphabet board. That night, it was used for something else entirely. Witnesses, those who dared to speak years later, claimed that Samuel was struck until the pointer splintered. His cries were met with the mechanical command, repeated by every other child in the room, "We will obey. We will learn what we are told." The floorboards beneath Samuel turned slick, the dark wood swallowing the small drops of blood, as though the building itself were complicit. No one intervened. No one could. The rules of the Murphy School were clear. A student's body did not belong to the student. The boy was never seen again. His bunk remained empty, but his name was not removed from the attendance list posted in the hallway, a subtle message to the others that even in absence the Murphys' control persisted. The next morning, the smell of lye lingered in the east wing. The servants scrubbed the floors until the wood looked pale and dry, but those who walked through swore they still felt a faint tackiness beneath their feet. After that night, escape attempts stopped, not because the children felt safer, but because they understood something essential. Running was worse than staying. Running meant you might become the next Samuel Kearney, and your memory might vanish into the cracks of the floorboards, never spoken of again. Parents continued to send their children, unaware, or perhaps willfully blind, to the reality behind the school's reputation for discipline. The Murphys, for their part, began to experiment with new forms of instruction, believing that fear was the truest foundation for learning. It was this night, this first act of bloodshed, that marked the true transformation of the Murphy School. From that point on, it was no longer an educational institution. It was a laboratory for the conditioning of obedience, and the subjects were not willing participants. What the Murphys did next would take their methods from cruelty to something far more calculated, something that in time would draw the attention of men in positions of power who had uses for children trained to obey without question. There are secrets so dangerous, so corrosive, that even speaking them aloud can turn friends into enemies and draw the attention of powers you cannot see. The men who operated the school knew this well. They did not merely run an institution, they ruled it like a hidden kingdom, bound together by an oath so severe that breaking it meant more than death. It meant erasure. The document was never written on ordinary paper. Those who survived claimed it was inscribed on calfskin parchment, darkened by a mixture of iron gall ink and something more sinister, the dried residue of human blood. Each instructor, each groundskeeper, each silent servant was made to place their hand upon it, not in daylight, but under the thin light of a crescent moon. The headmaster would speak the vow in a voice that seemed to come from far away, and the initiate would repeat it word for word. "I forfeit my name, my breath, my life, if I speak of what the walls have heard." It was not just theater. People who whispered about the school's inner workings, just whispered, were found days later in the river, their bodies bloated, their faces unrecognizable. Not a single one was ever investigated by the sheriff. That, too, was part of the arrangement. The local law didn't dare set foot past the front gates, not even to serve a warrant. Inside, the oath acted like a disease. Once taken, it seemed to infect the soul. The servants no longer met each other's eyes. Instructors spoke in clipped, unfinished sentences, as if fearing that even casual conversation might wander too close to forbidden ground. Even the children seemed to understand that there were places they could not look, hallways they could not walk, and questions they could never ask. And there was one rule that towered above the rest: never, under any circumstances, speak of the basement. The basement was not in the architectural plans. Ome claimed it stretched beneath the school for hundreds of feet, with rooms carved directly into the bedrock, lit by oil lamps that never went out. Others said it was older than the building itself, a remnant of something built centuries before, when the land belonged not to the state, but to men who answered to no government at all. Late at night, students lying awake in their narrow beds could hear the sounds: chains dragging, faint metallic clicks, something like a whisper, and sometimes a scream. The instructors pretended to hear nothing, but every child understood the truth. The basement was where disobedient students went, and none of them ever came back. This wasn't just about keeping the school's reputation clean. The oath, the silence, the fear, they were all part of something bigger, something older. It was as if the institution itself demanded secrecy, as though it fed on it. Every unanswered question made it stronger. Every truth left unspoken kept the walls standing another year. Once a young instructor, a man named Garrison, made the mistake of asking too much. He had seen the headmaster carry a small girl down the basement steps in the middle of the night. The next morning, her bed was empty, her belongings gone. Garrison tried to confront him, but 2 days later, his room was stripped bare and his name was erased from every payroll ledger, every record. Even the townspeople claimed they had never heard of him. Some say he fled, others say he's still down there. The power of the oath was not in the punishment, it was in the certainty that you would never be found again. Charleston, December 3rd, 1859. The morning air was heavy with the scent of brine and coal smoke, the kind that clings to the streets and settles in the lungs like a warning. The city was waking, yet within the narrow corridors of St. Augustine's, something was conspicuously absent, the steady voice of Father Elijah Mallory. His door remained shut, his bed untouched, and upon his desk a single candle had burned down to nothing, leaving only a pool of hardened wax, as though time itself had stopped in the middle of the night. The last man to see him alive was a dock worker named Samuel Whitcomb, who swore that at precisely 1:37 a.m. he spotted Mallory walking alone along the waterfront. But Whitcomb described something that no one in the church dared believe. The preacher was not wearing his cassock nor his silver crucifix. Instead, he was dressed in a plain wool coat, a leather satchel slung over his shoulder, and his steps were hurried, almost panicked. He never looked back. By sunrise, rumors had already spread like fire in a dry field. Some whispered that the preacher had received a death threat. Others claimed he was meeting a ship bound for Europe. And a few, those who had always feared his obsession with forbidden texts, insisted that Mallory had finally crossed a line no man of God should cross. His chambers offered little comfort to those searching for answers. The Bible he had read from daily was missing. The drawers of his desk were empty, save for one thing, a folded map of Charleston, but not the Charleston of 1859. It was older, decades older, with strange markings in red ink, circles over warehouses, alleyways, and a spot deep in the marshlands beyond the city. The church elders met behind closed doors. What they discussed remains unknown, though afterward they made a single public statement: Father Mallory has taken leave for spiritual retreat. The words sounded rehearsed, as though prepared long before his vanishing. But not everyone believed the official story. Dockside merchants swore they saw two men in dark coats waiting near the pier that night. A washerwoman claimed she heard voices in the rectory, low, heated, threatening, just before the silence fell. And in the weeks that followed, 3 parishioners left Charleston without a word, abandoning their homes and livelihoods, as if the preacher's disappearance was not an isolated event, but the first domino in something far larger. One haunting detail emerged months later. A fisherman dragging his nets in the Ashley River pulled up a rotted scrap of cloth, a fragment of a wool coat, still carrying the faint scent of frankincense. In the pocket was a brass key, ornate and heavy, unlike anything made in Charleston. The fisherman sold it to a pawn shop for a handful of coins. 2 days later, that pawn shop burned to the ground under circumstances no one could explain. Father Mallory's name was never spoken in St. Augustine's again. His portrait was removed from the rectory wall. His sermons were struck from the archives. It was as if he had never existed. And yet, his absence was louder than his presence had ever been. Because in Charleston, when a man disappears without a trace, the city swallows him. But when the city tries to erase him, it means someone, somewhere, wants you to forget why. The story of the Chamberlain dynasty had already taken on a weight that pressed against the lungs of every man, woman, and child in Franklin County. But in the autumn of 1866, an event occurred that welded fear into the bones of the townsfolk, a moment that even the most skeptical could not dismiss. It began with a girl no older than 9, known only as Elsie. She was not a Chamberlain by blood, but she was one of the orphans adopted into their household, part of the labor force the family quietly accumulated. Elsie was different from the others. Her eyes had a glassy, haunted look, as though they saw more than they should, and she was always holding a single object, a small porcelain doll with a frayed cotton dress. On a Sunday morning, when the Chamberlains had gathered the children to attend service at St. Matthew's, Elsie arrived late, walking alone. She moved slowly down the aisle, head bowed, doll clutched in her arms. But the congregation froze when they noticed something on the doll's white dress, a deep, spreading stain the color of old wine. Blood. The preacher stopped mid-sermon. The air became leaden. The sound of someone's hymn book hitting the floor was deafening in the silence. When asked where she had been, Elsie whispered a single sentence. "She told me to bring it." No one knew who she was, and no one wanted to. But the sheriff, pressed by the sudden unrest, questioned the girl privately. The official record would later claim she said nothing more, but one of the deputies swore she confessed that the doll had been sleeping in the earth, and she had dug it up from behind the Chamberlain barn. When she brushed the dirt away, the blood was already there. The Chamberlains, of course, denied everything. They claimed Elsie had fallen and cut herself, and that the doll was stained from that accident, but the more they explained, the lesser Neon believed them. That week, rumors spread that the stain had not faded, that even after the doll was scrubbed, boiled and bleached, the mark remained as vivid as the first day. Some said it wasn't paint or blood, but a kind of curse, bound to the porcelain itself. And then Elsie was gone. By the following Thursday, she was nowhere to be found. The Chamberlains claimed she had gone to live with relatives in Tennessee, but no letter, no trace, no proof ever surfaced. And the doll, locked away in a small chest in the Chamberlain attic, seen only by the family, or so it was claimed. Years later, long after the dynasty crumbled, that attic was cleared. The chest was found. Inside was the doll, still wearing the same cotton dress, the stain just as dark as the day Elsie had walked into St. Matthew's. Some say that if you look too long into the doll's glass eyes, you'll see a reflection that isn't your own. Others believe the doll isn't cursed at all, only a piece of evidence from one of the 74 unmarked graves beneath the Chamberlain lands. But there's one thing no one disputes. After the day Elsie appeared in church with the blood-stained doll, the town's whispered fear became a roaring certainty. The Chamberlains were not merely rich, they were dangerous, and their wealth was built on something far older and far darker than cotton. Because in that moment, Franklin County began to understand the truth. Some legacies are written not in ink or gold, but in blood that refuses to fade. They say a prison is made of bricks and bars. They are wrong. The most suffocating prisons are built from doubt, despair, and fear. Every day you wake up, a silent war is being fought inside you. It is not a war of swords, but of choices. A war where the enemy is not another person, but the whisper in your head saying, "You can't, you won't, it's too late." Charleston's 1859 story teaches us this. Once a man begins to believe those whispers, he has already chained himself. You've seen this in history, and you've felt it in your own life. The preacher didn't vanish because the world was too strong. He vanished because he let his will die before his body disappeared. Here's the truth no one dares to tell you. Every time you delay action, every time you accept less than what you are worth, every time you let others define your limits, you're building the bridge that leads to the death of your will. This is why so many men, even the strongest ones, suddenly collapse into obscurity. They don't fall in battle. They fade in silence. The Charleston preacher's enemies didn't have to kill him. They only had to surround him with doubt, feed him visions of hopelessness, until he walked himself into the shadows. In your own life, there will be days when everything feels heavy, when it seems safer to stand still than to move forward. Those days are the most dangerous, because that's when your enemies, whether outside or inside, win without lifting a finger. The bridge between life and the death of will is not crossed in a single dramatic step. It is crossed slowly, one compromise, one excuse, one missed opportunity at a time. If you want to remain alive, not just breathing, but alive in spirit and force, you must guard your will as if it were your last weapon. Never let a single day pass without acting toward your purpose. Even a small step is a victory, because action is the fire that keeps your will alive, and a man without will is already in the grave, even if his heart still beats. History remembers the strong, not because they avoided fear, but because they acted through it. If you do not master your will, the world will master it for you, and the world's hands are cold, cruel, and quick to bury what does not fight back. So ask yourself tonight, are you building your bridge to power, or are you building your bridge to the death of your will? Only you can decide, and your decision will decide whether you live as a force or vanish as a shadow. It was late November of 1859 when a dusty, tattered envelope arrived at the Charleston post office. It bore no return address, no seal, only a single name scrawled in hurried script: Jonathan Mercer. The clerk who handled it swore the paper was warm to the touch, as if it had been pressed against a body moments before delivery. Inside was not a letter, but a folded sheet of parchment so brittle it cracked at the edges, and on that parchment was a map, one that did not belong to any cartographer of the city. The map bore the faint outline of Charleston's streets, but they were twisted, skewed, slightly wrong, as if drawn from memory by someone whose eyes had seen the city from above, or far below. Buildings appeared that no record claimed existed, marked only with strange glyphs, shapes not of Latin letters but of something older, sharper, like cuts into the page. At the very center of the map was a single word: severance. No one knew who Mercer was, or why the map was sent to him, but the preacher's last surviving friend, a man named Elias Crow, claimed to have seen the parchment just once before. According to Crow, the preacher had carried it in the inside pocket of his coat for years, telling no one where it came from. The marks, Crow said, were not meant to guide, they were meant to warn. Rumors swirled. Some said the map traced an underground network of forgotten burial vaults beneath Charleston, predating the city itself. Others whispered it was a diagram of influence, a chart showing which families secretly controlled the city's wealth and which had been erased from history. The glyphs, they claimed, marked the sites of quiet executions, places where men vanished without ever touching the gallows. One symbol stood out, a spiral carved into the paper near the edge of the Cooper River. In every telling of the preacher's story, that spiral reappears, in his sermons, in the margins of his Bible, even scratched into the wood of the pew where he last stood. Some believed it represented the eye of God, others something far older, something that watched not to bless, but to bind. Crow himself refused to speak of the map after that night. He told a reporter in 1861 that it was an invitation to step off the edge of the world and never come back. When pressed for details, he simply said, "I burned my copy. I pray to God no one else has theirs." But the map didn't vanish. By 1870, it had surfaced twice more, once in the possession of a banker found drowned in the harbor, his pockets filled with river silt, and once in the archives of a private library, bound between pages of a book no scholar admitted to cataloging. Each time it appeared, someone who had handled it was either dead or missing within the year. What makes the map so dangerous is not just what it shows, but the suggestion that there are places in Charleston, hidden in plain sight, that are not bound to the city's laws or even to its time. The preacher knew this. Perhaps that's why he disappeared. Perhaps the map is not a trail to find him, but a record of where he found something else. And if you look closely at its lines, they don't simply draw a city, they form the shape of a face. By the winter of 1846, the Institute's reputation had grown beyond the borders of Kentucky. Wealthy patrons from Boston, New Orleans, and even London sent their wayward sons here, believing Dr. Cornelius Sullivan could reform them through discipline and moral instruction. The reality was far darker. At the heart of the compound stood a small, octagonal stone building, the chapel, but the townsfolk never heard singing from its walls. Instead, they claimed that on moonless nights, strange murmurs floated from the chapel door, like dozens of voices speaking at once, though no candles burned within. Inside, the air was cold, even in summer. The floor was paved with dark slate, etched with symbols no one in town recognized. The pews were arranged in a circle, not in rows, and in the center stood a high-backed chair carved from blackened oak, a throne, really, facing no altar at all. On the walls hung oil portraits of past benefactors, their eyes painted so sharply that they seemed to follow any intruder. This was not a place for worshipping God. This was a chamber for invoking something else entirely. The older students whispered about sessions held here after midnight. The rules were simple: no speaking unless spoken to, and no turning your back on Dr. Sullivan. Those who broke either rule were taken below, a phrase no one dared explain. Survivors of these sessions emerged pale, their eyes unfocused, their tempers brittle. Some claimed they remembered nothing, others remembered too much, visions of faceless figures leaning in close, their breath like frost on the skin. A former groundskeeper later testified that he once saw Sullivan kneeling in the chapel with his hands clasped, but not in prayer. Instead, he was pressing his forehead to the stone floor, whispering in a language the man had never heard. The sound was like a lullaby and a threat intertwined. Oh, in the slate before him, a faint red light pulsed beneath the cracks, as if the floor itself were alive. When Sullivan rose, his face was flushed, his pupils wide as though from intoxication. Except the groundskeeper swore he smelled no wine. Rumor held that the Chapel of Whispers was built over the ruins of an older structure, something predating the town's founding by decades, perhaps even centuries. Some said it had been a French fur trader's way station, others swore it was a native burial ground. But in the taverns of nearby towns, darker tales persisted, that the land had been marked long before any European set foot here, and that Sullivan had chosen it deliberately. Whatever its origin, the chapel became a silent pivot point for the Institute's power. Parents thought it was where their children learned moral lessons. Students knew it was where their spirits were bent until they broke. Sullivan's control over his charges was no longer just physical, it was psychological, spiritual, perhaps even supernatural. Those who resisted him were not punished in public. Instead, they were invited to the chapel. No one refused. And the most chilling part, the few who left the Institute years later as grown men could still draw the chapel's floor pattern from memory, every line, every symbol. Some confessed they had dreams in which they were back there, standing in the center circle, unable to move, hearing that chorus of murmured voices all around them. By then, it was clear to those who dared look closer. The Chapel of Whispers was not simply a building, it was a ritual device, a place where Sullivan bound his students to him, not just in life, but in whatever came after. By the year 1868, the last stone of the Institute had already been swallowed by time, but the air in the valley still carried its stench. The town had changed, new families had moved in, children played where the carriage gates once stood, but for those who remembered, the silence was not peace. It was a cover. The records of Dr. Sullivan's patients had been burned, but the memory of their suffering lived in whispers. Former staff members, aged and trembling, were seen only rarely in public, always avoiding the gaze of strangers. Some claimed they had nightmares in which Sullivan's voice still spoke to them, instructing them to continue the work. Yet perhaps the most disturbing truth is that the Institute never truly ended. After its doors closed, medical equipment, journals, and even preserved specimens were quietly transferred to other facilities in the South. New buildings, hospitals, orphanages, charitable homes sprang up in Tennessee, Georgia, and Mississippi, each claiming to serve the poor and the sick. But hidden inside their foundations were Sullivan's methods, refined and passed on like a family inheritance. A chilling pattern emerged. The same treatments, the same secrecy, the same sudden disappearances of inconvenient patients. No one used the name Sullivan anymore, but his science lived on under other signatures. The experiments became more discreet, better disguised behind the language of advancement and public good. The valley where the Institute once stood became overgrown. Locals avoided it, insisting the soil was poisoned. Livestock refused to graze there. Even the birds flew around it, as if some silent frequency still pulsed beneath the earth. In the archives of the state, a single surviving document remains, a patient ledger charred at the edges. The names are faded, but one note is legible in the final column. Subject 74, transfer to continuation site, 1865. No location is given, no further records exist. And so the story of Dr. Cornelius Sullivan is not a closed chapter. It is a living infection. His name may have been erased from the medical world, but his shadow remains stitched into its anatomy. Perhaps you've seen it, in the cold detachment of a surgeon, in the experimental trial no one is allowed to question, in the way some lives are measured in usefulness rather than worth. The institute is gone. But its bloodline of thought, the belief that human suffering is merely a tool for progress, still walks among us. It hides in white coats, in polished offices, in the smiles of those who call themselves healers. And if you listen closely, you can still hear the echo of that voice, calm and commanding, saying, "Continue the work." By 1868, the Chamberlain estate had grown into something that, to an untrained eye, might look like a monument to southern prosperity. Sprawling cotton fields that shimmered under the sun, warehouses stacked with bales ready for shipment, and a manor house whose white-painted columns gleamed like ivory against the Tennessee sky. But beneath the manicured facade was a truth as heavy and immovable as the clay beneath their land. 74 human beings lay buried in unmarked graves across the property, their names absent from any church register, their deaths erased from county records. The Chamberlains knew the exact number, and they kept it in writing. It wasn't written in a Bible, nor hidden in the bottom of a locked trunk. The record was kept in a thick, leather-bound ledger, the kind merchants used for inventories. It was not a book of compassion or mourning, but an account of assets and losses. And in a chilling twist, the entries for the dead were marked not by names, but by codes. A mark resembling a small cross meant succumbed to illness. A small knife symbol indicated disposed of due to defiance. A triangle meant transferred off record, a euphemism for being sold under falsified papers. Every time a worker died, their value was calculated in cotton weight, converted into monetary loss, and entered into the ledger. The death of a man in his prime could be measured to the Chamberlains as 18 bales per annum, compounded loss in 3 years. The ledger didn't just record the past, it predicted the future. Pages contained careful estimates of which individuals would expire within the next season due to exhaustion, malnutrition, or punishment. In the twisted economics of the Chamberlain mind, even death was a line item in the business plan. It was Samuel Chamberlain, the eldest son, who insisted on this practice. Samuel was not the loud dominie, erring figure his father had been. He was quieter, colder, and far more calculating. He spoke rarely, and when he did, it was usually to assign numbers to people as if they were sacks of cottonseed. According to whispers from surviving workers, Samuel had a disturbing ritual. On nights when the air was thick and the cicadas screamed in the dark, he would take the ledger out to the back veranda, light a single oil lamp, and read aloud the coded entries of the dead, as if reciting a prayer to an unholy god of profit. No preacher ever set foot on the estate to bless the dead. No sermons were given. The only acknowledgement these 74 souls received was their reduction to figures in a book. But a book, even one guarded with such paranoia, can change hands. In late autumn of that year, a field boy named Thomas, who had been assigned as an errand runner for the manor, managed to glimpse a page while delivering tea to Samuel. The boy did not understand the codes at first, but he remembered them. Weeks later, when he escaped under cover of a storm, he carried the memory of those strange marks like burning coals in his mind. Years later, those same symbols would appear in testimony against the Chamberlains, decoded by abolitionists and journalists alike. The ledger itself vanished. Whether destroyed, hidden, or stolen remains one of the enduring mysteries of Tennessee's buried history. What is certain is this. In those years, the Chamberlains did not just harvest cotton from their fields. They harvested lives, carefully recorded, calculated, and erased, and believed the soil would never give up its secrets. They were wrong. The building no longer breathed like a place of learning. It had grown silent in a way that felt alive, predatory. Even from the road, travelers avoided looking too long at its crooked windows, as if meeting the gaze of something that might remember them later. The villagers whispered that the old Sullivan Medical Institute had begun to consume itself after the final experiments. Walls warped unnaturally, bending inward as though the very architecture were collapsing toward a hidden core. Floorboards groaned in the dead of night, not under the weight of footsteps, but as if the timber itself was remembering pain. Inside, the air was heavy with an odor that was neither decay nor dust, but something far more intimate. The scent of blood that had once been fresh, now trapped in the pores of the wood for decades. When the last patients disappeared in 1848, no one dared reclaim the land. A few opportunists tried. One man, John Mather, purchased the property, hoping to turn it into a boarding house. On his first night inside, he wrote in his ledger, "The rooms will not stay empty. They fill with sounds when I am not watching. Soft breathing, knocking from inside the walls." 3 weeks later, Mather was gone. His bed was found neatly made, his boots still beside it. The front door was locked from the inside. The sheriff's men tore up the floorboards looking for him, only to find a single object, a medical scalpel, driven into the wood so deep it could not be removed. After that, the Institute's reputation shifted from haunted house to living entity. Hunters swore the building could change its interior. Rooms stretched or shrank overnight. Corridors ended in walls that hadn't been there the day before. The surviving blueprints didn't match the reality. Even the chimney flues twisted like arteries. Some said Dr. Cornelius Sullivan had designed it that way from the start. Not as a school, but as a machine, a device to capture, contain, and recycle human suffering into something useful. By the winter of 1851, the town's council voted to burn it down. Men brought barrels of kerosene, torches, and prayer. Yet, when the flames touched the outer walls, the fire died out as if smothered. The timber didn't even blacken, it absorbed the heat. It was then that a preacher named Elias Turner warned the men to stop. He claimed the building was bound by a covenant sealed in flesh, and that to destroy it would be to release what was inside. His words unsettled them, because no one could tell if he was speaking metaphorically or confessing something he knew firsthand. And so it remained, a rotting skeleton of wood and stone at the edge of town, visible from the main road, yet utterly avoided. It did not decay like other buildings. Moss refused to grow on it. Birds would not land on its roof. The locals gave it a new name, the house that devoured itself, for it seemed to feed on the very essence of those who entered. Even now, more than a century later, there are nights when a faint light can be seen moving behind its warped windows, a slow, deliberate glow, as if someone is still in there, dissecting, studying, learning, and if you were to walk past on such a night, you might hear it too, the quiet creak of a floorboard, as though the house were shifting to make room for you. The winter of 1848 wrapped the Sullivan Institute in a silence more suffocating than any summer heat could ever bring. Snow gathered on the eaves of the main building, muting the outside world into a white, indifferent expanse. Inside, however, the air was anything but quiet. It was heavy, charged, with the kind of tension that makes the skin prickle before a storm. It was on one such night that Dr. Cornelius Sullivan summoned his most trusted orderly, Elijah Grant, to the upper chamber. Elijah had been with him since the early days, a loyal, silent witness to the horrors that unfolded behind the Institute's doors. But this meeting was different. The doctor did not speak with his usual authority. His voice was low, almost reverent, as if he were standing at the threshold of some great and terrible truth. "Elijah, I am dying." The words did not come with drama, no trembling or coughs, just a cold certainty. Sullivan's frame had grown thinner in recent months, his skin pale as the winter light, and yet his eyes burned brighter than ever. He motioned for Elijah to close the door, and what followed was less a conversation than a confession, a purging of decades' worth of secrets that the doctor could no longer carry into the grave without staining the soil itself. Sullivan spoke first of his so-called patients. He admitted what the whispers had always hinted. Many of them had never been ill at all. They were not admitted for their benefit, but for his study. Merchants' daughters, young soldiers, and even the occasional politician's son. They were all chosen with deliberate precision. Chosen because their disappearance would send ripples into the city's undercurrents of power. Chosen because their minds were blank pages upon which he could write his experiments in control. He told Elijah of the winter sessions, a series of experiments where the mind was not merely tested, but dismantled, layer by layer, until nothing remained but the fragments he wished to reassemble. He claimed these sessions were inspired not by medical necessity, but by an older, darker manuscript he had once studied in Europe, an unnamed codex written by a surgeon who believed madness could be engineered like a disease. "The city believes I was shaping minds for healing," Sullivan whispered, "but I was shaping them for obedience." Then came the confession Elijah had never expected. Sullivan admitted that the Institute's funding had not come solely from wealthy patrons or the state. Hidden among the ledgers, masked behind coded entries, was money from a clandestine society. Men who met in candlelit rooms, who believed that the control of a city began with the control of its most promising youth. Sullivan had been their instrument, but he insisted that he was no mere servant. He had ambitions beyond theirs, dreams of creating not just followers, but architects of a new order. "They feared me," he said with a thin smile, "and they were right to." Elijah, though trained in silence, could no longer keep his composure. He demanded to know the fate of those who had graduated from the Institute. Sullivan leaned forward, his voice almost breaking. Some went into the world with their memories wiped clean, unable to recall their own names. Others never left. "You have buried them, Elijah. You just did not know it." By the time the confession ended, dawn had begun to creep into the frost-laced windows. Dr. Sullivan slumped back into his chair, the weight of his words hanging in the air like smoke. He had not asked for forgiveness, only for the truth to be known, someday, by someone worthy of carrying it. That day would come sooner than he imagined. Within a week, Sullivan's body was found cold in his bed, his journal gone, and the Institute's most dangerous wing sealed, shut by men Elijah did not recognize. The confession had been real. But the question remained, had it been the whole truth, or just another manipulation from a man who had mastered the art of controlling every mind he touched? By the spring of 1859, Charleston's air was heavy with an unnatural stillness. It was the kind of silence that made even the most devout hesitate before speaking God's name aloud. Whispers of what had happened inside Reverend Elijah Harrow's church had already spread to the far edges of South Carolina. But now, for the first time, something tangible began to emerge, a collection of testimonies so disturbing that even the most loyal congregants started to look over their shoulders when passing the chapel's darkened windows. It began with a woman named Clara Winthrop, a midwife known for her discretion. She claimed she had been summoned to the church late one night by Harrow himself under the pretense of tending to a wounded parishioner. What she found instead was a man bound to a chair, his skin slick with sweat, his eyes rolling back in a feverish delirium. She swore that Harrow stood over him, whispering in a language she could not understand, pressing a silver crucifix into the man's chest until the flesh blistered. Clara left without a word, but her story would not stay silent for long. As the weeks passed, others came forward. A blacksmith spoke of hearing screams echoing from the church basement after midnight. A merchant's daughter confessed that she had been invited to a special service where Harrow locked the doors and made them kneel in darkness for hours, reciting verses not found in any Bible she had ever seen. These stories converged into something like a fever dream, too horrific to believe, yet too consistent to ignore. But the most damning testimony came from Thomas Whitlow, the church's gravedigger. Whitlow had been in Harrow's employ for nearly a decade, burying the dead behind the chapel under strict orders to keep the graves unmarked. He told investigators that, in the months before Harrow vanished, the number of graves he dug had doubled, yet there had been no corresponding funerals. Some of them, Whitlow whispered, were still warm. By then, Charleston was no longer whispering. It was roaring with speculation. Was Harrow a preacher or a predator, a prophet or a sorcerer? The local magistrates prepared to summon him for questioning, but Harrow was always one step ahead. He stopped preaching altogether, retreating to the rectory like a shadow sinking deeper into the earth. Then, one night, the chapel bells tolled 13 times, an ill omen in Charleston's superstitious circles. At dawn, the doors to the church were found wide open. Inside, the pews were overturned, candles burned to stubs, and the altar cloth was soaked with something dark and sticky. Harrow was gone. No note, no explanation, just a void where a man and a god used to be. For some, this was the end. They closed the church, boarded its windows, and told their children never to step foot near it. But for others, those whose faith had turned to obsession, this was only the beginning. They believed Harrow had not abandoned them. He had ascended to some higher plane. They spoke of his return, of a night when the bells would toll again, and the congregation would be called to finish what he had started. Charleston, in its polite southern way, tried to move on, but in the shadows of King Street, in the narrow alleys where sunlight never quite reached, there were still those who swore they heard his voice. Not in sermons, not in prayer, but in a low, steady whisper, calling them by name. The city had seen crime, it had seen fire, it had seen storms that swept away entire wharves. But what lingered after Elijah Harrow's disappearance was different. It was not destruction, it was not loss, it was a haunting. A requiem for the guilty, sung not in churches, but in the minds of those who had followed him willingly into the dark. And if you listened closely on certain nights, when the wind rattled the shutters and the harbor fog pressed against the windows, you could still hear it. The faint tolling of 13 bells. The storm that rolled in over Kentucky that night was not like any other. The clouds were heavy, bloated with water, and streaked with veins of lightning that seemed to crawl across the heavens like the fingers of a dead god. But it was not the sky that drew people from their beds. It was the sound. A sound rising from the ground itself. Out in the neglected cemetery behind the old medical institute, a single grave, one with no name, only a crude wooden marker, was making noise. At first, it was faint, a hum. The kind of low, haunting resonance that you could feel more than hear, rattling in the bones of your chest. Then, as the rain began to fall harder, it grew into something like a song, a deep, wordless melody that felt almost human, almost. By morning, everyone in the village had heard it. Men who laughed at superstition were pale, their lips tight. Women whispered about omens and curses. Children, for days afterward, drew strange shapes in the dirt, shapes that no one recognized, but that seemed eerily similar to diagrams found in Dr. Sullivan's hidden notes. The townsfolk tried to dig the grave up to find the source of the sound, but something stopped them. The rain had turned the soil into a black, clinging sludge that resisted every shovel. The deeper they went, the harder the earth seemed, as if the ground itself had decided this coffin would not be touched. That night, Sullivan's old assistant, now a gaunt and trembling man in his 50s, arrived in town. He went straight to the cemetery without speaking to anyone, without even removing his soaked coat. Witnesses say he knelt at the grave, pressed his ear to the wet soil, and whispered something over and over again. Then, without warning, he began to laugh. Not the laughter of a man who is amused, but the jagged, broken laughter of someone who has heard a truth too terrible to bear. By dawn, he was gone. Some claimed they saw him walking toward the river, his coat flapping in the wind, his shadow stretching unnaturally long behind him. Others swore they saw him vanish between the rows of graves, as if he had simply stepped into the earth. The grave still sang when it rained. It sang for the next 7 years, and then, without explanation, it stopped. But the silence was worse, because the night after it stopped, the first disappearance occurred. A young woman was found standing barefoot in the cemetery at dawn, her eyes glassy and unseeing, her lips moving as though she was mouthing words, but no sound came out. When she was questioned, she said only this: "It's not in the ground anymore." That phrase spread like a sickness, whispered from porch to porch, until it reached even the most distant farmhouses. Some moved away, abandoning their homes. Others stayed, too afraid to leave, believing that whatever had been buried there might follow them if they ran. The institute's ruins, visible from the cemetery gates, loomed like a silent witness. Every broken window a black, watchful eye. And though no one dared enter anymore, there were rumors that on certain nights, especially when the wind came from the south, you could hear the faintest trace of that melody again. Not from beneath the earth, but from the upper floors of the institute itself. By 1862, the Chamberlain estate had transformed into something no newspaper dared to name, a place both feared and revered. Locals called it the Sanctuary of Whispers. The name was not poetic, it was literal. Those who stepped inside swore they heard murmurs in the walls, faint voices speaking in old tongues, like the breath of the dead carried through hollow stone. The mansion was no longer simply a home, it was a labyrinth. Every new wing was constructed with hidden passages, false floors, and secret chambers no one entered without permission. The walls were thick, layered with imported oak and lead to muffle sound, yet certain spots seemed to hum faintly if you pressed your ear against them. Servants claimed that if you stood in the main hall at midnight, you could hear low conversations from nowhere, as though invisible men were plotting in the dark. The Chamberlains insisted these were old house sounds, the creaks and groans of settling timber, but in private, they treated these noises with reverence. In fact, they fed them, sitting in dim candlelight, speaking in hushed tones, as though offering their words to the very bones of the house. The whispers became a ritual, a form of communion. By this point, Elijah Chamberlain had taken full control of the cotton empire, expanding exports to European buyers who paid in gold. His siblings no longer worked the plantations, they managed information. Every ledger, every shipment, every contract was locked away in vaults only they could open. This was not a family that merely dealt in goods, they dealt in secrets. And the sanctuary served as the perfect vault. Deep beneath the estate, a subterranean archive was built, accessible only through a trapdoor hidden behind the chapel altar. Here, in the damp air, smelling faintly of oil and earth, were shelves lined with bound journals, letters, and blackmail documents, records of politicians' debts, merchants' affairs, and rival families' weaknesses. The Chamberlains didn't just survive in a world of power, they controlled it, brick by brick, whisper by whisper. But with power came paranoia. No one was allowed in or out of the sanctuary without a member of the family present. Servants were rotated every few months, never kept long enough to learn the mansion's layout. Carpenters who built hidden rooms vanished after their work was done, paid handsomely, according to Chamberlain spokesmen, though their families never saw them again. Outside, rumors began to fester. Some claimed the house itself was alive, that it was growing in unnatural ways, adding new rooms overnight. Others said it was cursed, its stones pulled from the ruins of a European monastery, known for housing forbidden scripture. And then there was the most unsettling claim, that the whispers were not echoes of the living, but the voices of those buried in the 74 unmarked graves scattered across Chamberlain land. By the end of that year, only the most desperate dared work for the family, yet despite the fear, the Chamberlains' wealth soared. Ships left the river docks under their seal, filled with cotton bound for London and Paris, their profits laundered through shell companies that no taxman could trace. Still, the whispers persisted, louder, closer. Servants began quitting mid-shift, pale and trembling, claiming that voices had followed them into their rooms, whispering their names in the dark. And Elijah? He welcomed it. Because for him, the whispers weren't a haunting. They were a warning, and he knew exactly who they were warning about. In the late hours of a storm-torn night in October of 1845, a strange glow pulsed from the attic windows of the medical institute. From the street below, the flicker looked like candlelight, yet it moved unnaturally, like a living flame bending to an unseen wind. Inside, Dr. Cornelius Sullivan stood at the center of a circle etched into the wooden floor, its edges scorched black by fire. The smell of burnt herbs and something far fouler filled the air. Before him lay not the cadaver of a patient, but the remains of something incomplete. It was human in form, but wrong in proportion. Too long in the limbs, the jaw distorted, the eyes wide and frozen in a stare that did not belong to the living. 3 men stood in the shadows, their faces hidden by heavy hoods. They were not doctors, not townsfolk, at least not anymore. These were the ones Sullivan referred to only as the silent benefactors. The ritual that night was not for healing, nor for the advancement of medical science. It was for sealing a pact. Sullivan's whispered incantations were in no language known to medicine, nor to any church, but they rolled off his tongue with the precision of long memorization. As the words reached their final cadence, one of the hooded men stepped forward with a silver basin filled with thick, dark blood that had been drawn not from the dead but from the living, unwillingly. Sullivan dipped his fingers into it, smearing the crimson substance across the distorted cadaver's chest, forming a crude symbol that seemed to pulse under the candlelight. Then, without hesitation, he sliced his own palm, letting his blood mingle with the rest. "You understand," one of the silent benefactors finally spoke, his voice deep, resonant, and chillingly calm. "Once sealed, this is no longer medicine, this is dominion." Sullivan nodded. "I am prepared." Prepared for what? The truth. Hidden from his students and the town was that Sullivan had reached a point in his career where the boundaries of science had ceased to interest him. Healing was a noble pursuit, but it offered no control. Life and death were limits he could manipulate, but not command outright. The pact promised him something far greater, mastery over the boundary itself. Lightning cracked outside, illuminating the strange assembly for an instant. The blood symbol on the cadaver's chest glistened, and for a moment its eyes moved. The silent benefactors stepped back, reciting a counterchant that seemed to make the air heavy. The candles bent inward, flames drawn as if by some invisible vacuum. The floor groaned. And then, silence. When Sullivan opened his eyes again, the cadaver's lips had curled into something like a smile. It did not move, it did not breathe, but its presence was undeniable. One of the hooded figures handed Sullivan a small leather-bound ledger. Inside were names, dozens of them. Each name was written alongside a single date. Some were marked with a small X. "These are the ones you will bring us," the man said. "In return, your work will never fail." Sullivan took the book without hesitation. That night marked a turning point for the medical institute. From then on, the experiments no longer sought cures, they sought vessels. And every time a name in the ledger was crossed out, Sullivan's influence in the town grew stronger, his miracle recoveries more miraculous, his failures non-existent. No one outside the institute understood why the doctor's gaze seemed sharper now, why his patient's eyes occasionally mirrored his own in a strange, hollow way. But to those few who had witnessed the blood-sealed pact, it was clear Cornelius Sullivan had bound himself not to medicine but to something far older and far darker, and the ledger, once begun, could never be emptied. The winter of 1865 was the kind that swallowed sound. Snow lay in thick sheets over the land, muffling the world into an eerie quiet. In towns nearby, fireplaces crackled with the comfort of family gatherings. But in the place where the Murphy family once ruled, warmth was a foreign concept. The building, abandoned by human law but still claimed by something older, stood like a tombstone against the white sky. By then, the legends had hardened into warnings. No one ventured there, not even the most reckless boys on a dare. Yet still, the rumors spread like frost on glass. They said the school lit itself from within on certain nights, as if the walls remembered the fires that had once devoured their victims, and those who saw the flames from afar swore they could hear screaming, high, shrill, and desperate. It began as a whisper in the taverns. The Murphy place was burning again. Men strapped on coats and stomped into the snow, drawn by a grim fascination they couldn't name. From the ridge, they could see it, an orange glow pulsing against the sky. The windows blazed with light, but when they got closer, there was no heat. The fire was an illusion, or perhaps something worse. They saw the outlines of figures moving behind the glass, shadows of people who should not exist. Children lined in rows, their faces pale and eyes empty. A woman's silhouette moving among them, her hand resting on each head like a twisted blessing. Those who stood too long claimed they felt the pull. It started in the chest, like their heartbeat was no longer their own, then crept to the skull, clouding thought. More than one man said they nearly stepped through the door before the spell broke. And in every retelling, the same detail emerged, a single voice calling them inside in a tone both tender and commanding. One man, a war veteran hardened by death, swore under oath that as he turned to flee, the glow of the building shifted, like the fire was no longer inside, but inside him. He didn't return to the tavern that night. He wandered the woods until dawn, muttering in a voice that wasn't his own. By morning, the building stood dark again. No scorch marks, no ash, no evidence of heat. But the townspeople knew better than to mistake absence for safety. The Murphys' legacy was not bound to the physical. It lived in the hunger of the land, in the air between the snowflakes, in the minds of those who had looked too closely. It was then that an older preacher, one who had tried for years to cleanse the place, delivered a sermon not from the Bible, but from his own fear. He told them, "Fire is supposed to consume and end a thing, but some fires are meant to keep something alive." That was the last time anyone attempted to investigate the property. It was left to rot under the weight of its own curse, and yet even rotting things can reach out, even dying fires can smolder, because evil doesn't need walls to live in, it only needs memory. And the Murphy fire, though unseen in daylight, still burned behind closed eyes in the dead of night. Those who had glimpsed it would wake at 3 a.m. to find their room flickering with a light that came from nowhere, except the past. The Murphy School didn't just kill its victims, it claimed them, and worse, it remembered them. The prison was supposed to be impenetrable. Its stone walls, blackened by decades of soot and weather, had been built to withstand riots, storms, and the gnawing teeth of time, but nothing could have prepared its keepers for the arrival of a man like Victor Holden. By the time the guards realized what was happening, it was already too late. On the night of October the 2nd, 1851, the rain fell in sheets so thick they looked like ropes of water hanging from the sky. Lightning flared, casting skeletal shadows across the courtyard. In the heart of that storm, a single carriage rolled to the prison gates, not the crude, mud-splattered wagons that usually delivered supplies, but a black, lacquered coach with silver accents that glimmered in the flickering torchlight. The driver was silent, his face hidden under a brimmed hat dripping with rain. He handed the gatekeeper a sealed letter, stamped with the crimson insignia of the War Department. The message was clear. One prisoner was to be transferred immediately to a secure federal facility. The orders were signed with a name no guard dared to question. The prisoner's name? Elias Ward. The very man whose testimony had once brought Victor Holden's empire to its knees. Inside his cell, Elias was pacing, muttering to himself, his mind gnawed by years of isolation. He didn't believe the guards when they told him he was being moved, but the moment he stepped outside and saw the black carriage waiting in the storm, something inside him froze. He didn't know why, but he felt as though he was walking into the mouth of a predator. The guards chained him, marched him into the coach and slammed the door shut. Inside, it was pitch black, until a single match flared to life. And there he was, Victor Holden. Older now, his once dark hair streaked with silver, but the same unyielding eyes that had stared down judges, tycoons and minis. "Turs." Elias tried to speak, but his voice failed him. The match burned low and Victor lit a single lantern between them. "You thought I had forgotten you," Victor said, his voice calm, almost tender. "You thought the years and the walls would keep you safe." Elias swallowed hard. "What do you want from me?" Victor leaned forward, the flickering lantern casting his features into something almost inhuman. "You took something from me, Elias. Something you had no right to touch. And now, I've come to take something from you." The carriage moved, wheels grinding over cobblestones, heading not toward any government facility, but deeper into the countryside. The rain's pounding was the only sound, save for Elias's ragged breathing. Hours later, the coach stopped. The doors swung open to reveal a desolate stretch of marshland. A fog as thick as wool clung to the ground. In the distance, the faint outline of a building could be seen, an old hunting lodge, long abandoned, its roof sagging like the spine of a corpse. Victor stepped out first, his boots sinking slightly into the mud. He gestured for Elias to follow. The guards, or were they guards, said nothing. Their faces were blank, almost expressionless, like men under some unseen spell. Inside the lodge, a fire roared in the hearth, its heat unable to dispel the chill in the air. The room smelled of damp wood and something else, something metallic. On the wall hung a single framed portrait. Elias recognized the face instantly, the woman he had loved, the same woman who had once been Victor Halden's wife. "You see," Victor said quietly, "this was never about the trial, or the money, or even the betrayal in the papers. This was always about her." The door shut behind them, the sound final and absolute, and in that moment, Elias realized that the storm outside was the least of his problems. Victor Halden hadn't come for justice. He had come for an ending. By the winter of 1868, the Chamberlain estate no longer resembled a southern mansion. Its once proud columns stood cracked and stained, its gardens had withered into thorned wilderness, and the air hung thick with the smell of stagnant water and something else, something metallic, almost like blood. But beneath its decay lay a secret stronger than mortar and brick, the unholy pact that had bound the family for decades. James Chamberlain, now stooped with age but still possessing eyes sharp enough to cut through the soul, summoned his 3 surviving children to the great dining hall. The table where hundreds of lavish feasts had once been served now bore nothing but a single black candle and a heavy leather-bound ledger. Its cover was cracked, and its pages were yellowed, but each entry pulsed with a power that was more than ink. This was the record of their fortune, written in the blood of those buried in the 74 unmarked graves. "This book," James rasped, running his fingers over the cover, "is our lifeline. Without it, our land, our name, and our influence would wither and die. This is not just a record, it is a contract, and it demands payment." The youngest, Henry, shifted uncomfortably. He had always been the most reluctant participant in the family's dealings, haunted by nightmares of the cries he'd heard as a boy, cries that came from the fields after dark. "Father," he said, his voice shaking, "the war is over. The North is watching us. We can't keep doing this." James's lips curled into something that was neither a smile nor a snarl. "War changes nothing for men who hold power the right way. Do you think the Union cares about a few bodies in the ground? Power is fed by sacrifice, Henry, and we," his voice dropped into a whisper, "we are starving." The candlelight flickered, casting twisted shadows across their faces. From the far end of the room, Margaret, though the eldest and most ruthless, spoke with a calm certainty that chilled the air. "Then we feed again. There are still families on the outskirts. The war has made them desperate. Desperation makes for easy bargains." Henry stood, his chair scraping against the floor like a scream. "No, I won't be part of this." But James's withered hand slammed the ledger shut with a force that echoed through the hall. "You think you can walk away?" he hissed. "This is in your blood. The land has taken from you and you have taken from it. It will never let you go." What none of them spoke aloud was the truth that lay between the lines of the ledger. The pact had been made not just with men, but with something older. Every death, every offering had been a transaction, one that granted the Chamberlain's influence, protection, and a strange kind of immunity. But the moment the pact was broken, all debts would come due. That night, Henry fled the estate, taking nothing but the clothes on his back. But as he reached the river, he saw lights flickering behind him, not lanterns, but strange, cold flames dancing in the mist. And for the first time in years, he heard it again, the voices of the dead calling his name from the fields. Back at the estate, James opened the ledger once more and dipped his quill into a small vial of dark liquid. "Then we begin again," he said, and wrote a single name on the next empty line. It was Henry's. By the end of the winter of 1870, the Murphy name had been reduced to whispers, spoken only in fear, in bars after midnight, and in the creaking backrooms of Manhattan's oldest buildings. The great institution they had built, the House of Reform and Discipline, no longer bore their crest, but its walls still echoed with the same terror, the same unbroken chain of control they had perfected. The newspapers had moved on to fresher scandals, but the truth, the real truth, remained buried in the same earth as their 74 unmarked graves. The final blow came quietly, as it always does for those who believe themselves untouchable. On a bitter March evening, Elijah Murphy, the last surviving patriarch, was found sitting at his desk, a half-empty glass of whiskey at his side. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows over a desk cluttered with letters he never mailed. One letter, written but never sealed, was addressed to no one. It read simply, "We did not create the monster. We simply fed it, raised it, gave it a name." The coroner declared it a stroke. Those who knew better understood. Power had abandoned him, and for a Murphy, that was a death sentence. But Elijah's passing did not erase the machinery they had built. It merely changed the hands that turned the gears. The school was purchased under another name, its ledger scrubbed, its records altered. The same curriculum of discipline and obedience continued, just without the public branding of the Murphy crest. The children still learned to obey without question, to submit to authority without thought, to see themselves as tools, not individuals. The city moved forward, paved roads, new factories, taller buildings. But beneath the surface, the Murphy philosophy seeped into new institutions, banks, political offices, charitable boards. The same men who once took whiskey with the Murphys now wore different coats. Bull. They followed the same playbook: control the young and you control the future. There are stories, unconfirmed but persistent, that the Murphy bloodline didn't vanish at all. That certain families in modern Manhattan carry their name like a dormant seed, hidden in marriage records and altered birth certificates. That the crest, the M, can still be found carved discreetly into the woodwork of certain old buildings, where only those who know where to look will see it. And here's the thing that most people will never understand. The Murphy legacy was never just about one family. It was about the system they perfected, a structure that can be passed on, like a hidden inheritance, from one generation to the next. The Murphys taught the city something dark and permanent, that fear is a better teacher than love, that obedience lasts longer than hope, and that power is most secure when it wears the mask of protection. If you walk through the old districts of Manhattan today, past the cracked brickwork and forgotten alleyways, you might still feel it, that weight in the air, that invisible hand guiding your steps. And if you find yourself standing before a certain weathered building, its shutters warped, its windows blind, you may notice something carved faintly above the doorway. Order through discipline. The motto of a dynasty that never truly died. And maybe, just maybe, you'll realize that the Murphy family isn't gone. They've just changed the name on the door.